In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where shadows dance between life and death, a single bullet can change the course of history. This is the true story of Sergeant Maria Santos, a woman whose steady hands and eagle eyes turned the tide when her brothers in arms faced their darkest hour. When confidence becomes arrogance and hunters become the hunted, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. In a world where split-second decisions determine who goes home and who doesn't, one female sharpshooter proved that heroes don't always announce themselves with loud voices and bold gestures. Sometimes they whisper through the silence of a perfectly aimed shot. The morning sun barely touched the rocky peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains when Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison received what would become the most dangerous assignment of his military career. The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Chapman was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as Colonel Richards spread the reconnaissance photos across the metal table. Intelligence suggests there's a high-value target meeting happening in this compound. The colonel pointed to a cluster of mud brick buildings nestled in a valley 30 miles northeast of their position. We need eyes on the ground, solid confirmation before we can authorize an airstrike. Morrison studied the photos carefully. The compound sat like a fortress in the narrow valley, surrounded by steep cliffs and accessible only through 2 mountain passes. It was the kind of place that made experienced soldiers nervous, the kind of terrain where ambushes happened and good men disappeared forever. "Sir, this looks like a perfect kill box," Morrison said, his weathered face creased with concern. "If they spot us going in, we'll have nowhere to run." Colonel Richard nodded grimly. "That's why we're sending the best. Your scout team has been in these mountains longer than anyone. If anyone can get in and out clean, it's you and your boys." The scout team consisted of 6 highly trained soldiers who had worked together for over 2 years in the Afghan theater. Besides Morrison, there was Corporal Danny "Ghost" Williams, their communications specialist who could make radios work in conditions that would stump engineers. Sergeant First Class Mike Tank Rodriguez brought explosive expertise and the kind of steady nerves that kept everyone alive when things went sideways. Private First Class Tommy Chun was their youngest member, but possessed an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and spot danger before it materialized. Then there were the Martinez brothers, identical twins from Texas who had joined the Army together and refused to be separated. Carlos handled reconnaissance photography and surveillance equipment, while his brother Luis served as their medic and backup sniper. The twins had an uncanny ability to communicate without words, finishing each other's sentences and coordinating movements like they shared the same brain. What none of them knew was that Sergeant Maria Santos had been quietly reassigned to provide overwatch for their mission. Santos was a different breed of soldier altogether. Born in East Los Angeles to immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything for their daughter's education, she had surprised everyone by choosing military service over the full scholarship to UCLA that had been gathering dust on her bedroom dresser. Santos had discovered her gift with a rifle during basic training at Fort Benning. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 300 meters, she was consistently placing shots center mass at twice that distance. Her drill sergeants initially thought it was luck, but when she repeated the performance day after day, they realized they had something special on their hands. The Army Sniper School at Fort Benning was brutal. Out of 30 candidates in her class, only 8 graduated. Santos wasn't just the only woman to complete the program. She finished second in overall rankings and first in long-distance precision shooting. Her instructors noted that she possessed an almost supernatural ability to read wind patterns and environmental conditions, adjusting her shots with mathematical precision that seemed to come naturally. But Santos was more than just an exceptional marksman. She understood that being a sniper meant being invisible, patient, and completely self-reliant. While other soldiers moved in groups and relied on their teammates for support, snipers worked alone, sometimes for days at a time, waiting for the perfect shot. It required a special kind of mental toughness that many strong soldiers simply didn't possess. After sniper school, Santos had been deployed to Iraq for 2 tours before being transferred to Afghanistan. She had 43 confirmed kills to her credit, each one carefully documented and verified according to military protocol. But Santos never talked about the numbers. For her, each shot represented a life saved, usually the life of an American soldier who would have died if she hadn't been there to eliminate the threat. Her reputation in Afghanistan was legendary among both American forces and enemy combatants. Taliban fighters had started calling her Al-Munakima, which meant the Avenger in Arabic. They knew that certain areas became death traps when a silent American woman was watching, and they had learned to fear the places where she might be hiding. Colonel Richards had specifically requested Santos for overwatch on Morrison's mission, but he hadn't shared this information with the scout team. Military protocol sometimes required compartmentalized information, and the colonel believed that Morrison's team would perform better if they thought they were operating independently. It was a decision that would prove to be both controversial and life-saving. Morrison gathered his team in their quarters that evening to discuss the mission details. The compound they were targeting sat in a valley that intelligence reports suggested was being used as a meeting place for senior Taliban commanders planning coordinated attacks on American convoys. The mission was straightforward in concept, but dangerous in execution. Infiltrate the area, establish a hidden observation post, photograph the high-value targets, and transmit the intelligence back to base for confirmation. We go in light and fast, Morrison explained, pointing to a hand-drawn map of the target area. Minimal gear, maximum mobility. If this goes sideways, we need to be able to move quickly through rough terrain. Ghost Williams, their communication specialist, checked his equipment one final time. The radio gear was their lifeline to base, and he had backup systems for the backup systems. In the mountains of Afghanistan, communication equipment was notoriously unreliable, and losing contact with base could mean the difference between rescue and abandonment. Tank Rodriguez inventoried his explosive supplies. As their demolitions expert, he carried enough C4 to clear obstacles or create diversions if they needed to fight their way out of trouble. Tank was a quiet professional who had learned his trade during urban combat in Iraq, where improvised explosive devices were a constant threat, and knowing how to handle explosives could save entire squads from hidden bombs. Tommy Chun studied satellite photos of their infiltration route, memorizing every ridge, valley, and potential hiding spot along the way. Despite being the youngest team member, Chun had an intuitive understanding of mountain warfare that came from growing up in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. He could read terrain like other people read books, understanding how weather patterns, seasonal changes, and natural formations could provide either concealment or deadly exposure. The Martinez brothers worked together to prepare their specialized equipment. Carlos packed the high-resolution cameras and surveillance gear they would need to document the target compound, while Luis organized the medical supplies that could keep them alive if someone got wounded far from base. The twins had developed their own system of hand signals and silent communication that allowed them to coordinate perfectly even in complete darkness. None of them questioned why the mission briefing had been so detailed about their insertion route, but vague about extraction procedures. In special operations, it was common for extraction plans to remain flexible based on what teams discovered in the field. They trusted their commanders to provide support when needed and focused on the immediate challenges of getting to the target and completing their reconnaissance. What they didn't know was that Taliban intelligence networks had been tracking American patrol patterns for months. Local informants had reported unusual activity around the base, and enemy commanders suspected that a major operation was being planned. The compound that Morrison's team was targeting had been deliberately set up as bait, a trap designed to capture or kill American special operations soldiers whose intelligence value would be enormous. Santos began her own mission preparation 12 hours before the scout team was scheduled to depart. Unlike the other soldiers, she would be working completely alone, carrying everything she needed for potentially several days of independent operation. Her rifle was a customized M24 sniper weapon system, modified with a specialized scope that allowed for accurate shooting at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. Her equipment reflected the unique demands of mountain sniper operations. She carried enough food and water for 4 days, a lightweight sleeping system that would keep her alive in sub-freezing temperatures, and camouflage materials that would make her virtually invisible against the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains. Everything was designed to be lightweight, but absolutely reliable because there would be no resupply and no backup if something went wrong. Santos had spent hours studying the same reconnaissance photos that Morrison's team was reviewing, but she was looking for different details. While the scout team focused on infiltration routes and observation positions, she was identifying potential sniper hides and calculating shooting angles that would give her the best fields of fire if the mission went bad. Her experience told her that the compound looked suspicious. The buildings were positioned in a way that suggested defensive planning, and the surrounding terrain offered too many perfect positions for enemy fighters to establish interlocking fields of fire. It had the characteristics of a well-planned ambush site, the kind of place where overconfident enemies might try to trap American soldiers. But Santos kept these observations to herself. Her mission was to provide overwatch and emergency support, not to second-guess the intelligence assessments that had led to the mission approval. She would be in position to help if needed, but she hoped that Morrison's team would complete their reconnaissance quickly and extract without incident. The night before departure, Morrison made his final rounds, checking on each team member and ensuring that everyone understood their individual responsibilities. These men had been through combat together, had saved each other's lives multiple times, and had developed the kind of trust that can only be forged under fire. They were confident in their abilities and ready for whatever challenges awaited them in the mountains. Ghost Williams ran final communications checks, establishing backup frequencies and confirming that their radio equipment was compatible with base station systems. In the mountains, radio waves behaved unpredictably, bouncing off rock formations and being absorbed by atmospheric conditions. Having multiple communication options could mean the difference between successful extraction and being abandoned in enemy territory. Tank Rodriguez performed last-minute maintenance on his weapons, cleaning every component and checking ammunition supplies. In special operations, equipment failure at the wrong moment could doom an entire mission. Every weapon, every piece of gear, every system had to function perfectly when lives depended on split-second performance. Tommy Chun reviewed topographical maps one final time, noting elevation changes and potential observation positions that might not have been visible in satellite photos. His ability to read terrain had saved the team multiple times during previous missions, and he wanted to be prepared for any geographical surprises they might encounter. The Martinez brothers completed their final equipment checks, ensuring that cameras, medical supplies, and surveillance gear were properly secured and easily accessible. They had worked together for so long that they functioned almost like a single soldier with two bodies, each anticipating what the other would need before it became necessary. None of them slept well that night. Combat veterans develop an instinct for danger that operates below the conscious level, and something about this mission felt different. The intelligence seemed too convenient, the target too perfectly positioned, the whole situation too much like the kind of setup that had killed good soldiers in the past. But they were professionals, and they had their orders. When dawn came, they would begin what would become the most dangerous mission of their military careers, walking into a trap that had been months in the making. The only thing standing between them and disaster was a female sniper who would be watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment when her steady hands and perfect aim would mean the difference between life and death for 6 American soldiers who didn't even know she was there. Dawn broke over the Afghan mountains with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every rock formation stand out like a photograph. Morrison's scout team moved through the darkness before sunrise, their boots making soft crunching sounds on the frost-covered ground as they began their infiltration toward the target compound. Each man carried approximately 60 pounds of gear, enough supplies for 3 days of independent operation in hostile territory. Santos had departed 2 hours earlier, taking a different route that would position her in the high ground overlooking the target valley. She moved like a ghost through the mountain terrain, her camouflage clothing helping her blend seamlessly with the rocky landscape. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to leave minimal trace of her passage. In sniper operations, invisibility wasn't just an advantage, it was survival. The terrain was brutal even by Afghanistan standards. Steep rocky slopes gave way to narrow valleys filled with loose scree that could shift unexpectedly under a soldier's weight. The altitude made breathing difficult, and the temperature swung from below freezing during the night to uncomfortably hot once the sun rose above the peaks. It was the kind of environment that tested every aspect of military training and physical conditioning. Morrison's team moved in a tactical formation that had been perfected through months of combat operations. Tommy Chun took point, his natural ability to read terrain allowing him to find the safest path through the treacherous landscape. The Martinez brothers followed, carrying the specialized surveillance equipment they would need to document their targets. Tank Rodriguez and Ghost Williams brought up the rear, watching for signs of enemy movement and maintaining communication with base. The first indication that something was wrong came when Shin spotted fresh footprints in a patch of soft ground near a mountain stream. The prints were from military-style boots, but they were an American issue. More importantly, they appear to be less than 12 hours old, which meant that enemy forces had been moving through the area recently. Morrison called a halt and gathered his team for a quick conference. The presence of enemy footprints didn't necessarily mean the mission was compromised, but it did suggest that Taliban forces were more active in the area than intelligence reports had indicated. They could abort the mission and return to base, or they could proceed with increased caution and awareness. "What do you think, Ghost?" Morrison asked his communications specialist. "Are we walking into something we can't handle?" Williams adjusted his radio headset and checked their current position against the mission parameters. Base is expecting regular check-ins every 2 hours. If we abort now, we'll have to explain why we turned back before even reaching the target area. Command isn't going to be happy about that. The team weighed their options carefully. They were still several miles from the target compound, and the footprints could belong to local villagers or Taliban forces that were simply passing through the area. Aborting the mission based on circumstantial evidence would require extensive justification, and there was always pressure from higher command to complete assigned reconnaissance tasks. Tank Rodriguez examined the footprints more closely, using his combat experience to assess the potential threat level. Looks like maybe 4 or 5 individuals, probably carrying weapons based on the depth of the impressions. They were moving east to west, which means they weren't heading toward our target area. Chen studied the surrounding terrain, looking for signs of recent enemy activity beyond the footprints. No evidence of camps or observation posts. Could be a patrol that was just passing through. If we modify our approach route slightly, we can avoid their most likely path. The Martinez brothers exchanged one of their wordless communications, and Carlos spoke for both of them. We've come this far. The target compound is still 4 hours away, and we haven't seen any other signs of enemy presence. We can proceed with increased security measures. Morrison made the decision that thousands of military leaders have faced in combat zones around the world. With incomplete information and pressure to accomplish the mission, he chose to continue forward rather than abort based on what might be false alarm. It was a reasonable decision based on the available evidence, but it was exactly the kind of calculation that the Taliban commanders had anticipated when they planned their elaborate trap. Santos had reached her overwatch position while Morrison's team was still debating their course of action. She had selected a rocky outcropping approximately 1,500 meters from the target compound, a position that provided excellent fields of fire while offering natural concealment among the broken stone formations. Her sniper hide was virtually invisible from below, camouflaged so effectively that someone could walk within 10 feet without detecting her presence. Through her high-powered scope, Santos could see the compound clearly. Something about it bothered her immediately. The buildings looked occupied with fresh repairs and recently cleared pathways, but there were no signs of normal civilian activity. No children playing, no women hanging laundry, no men working in the small gardens that were typical of Afghan rural compounds. More troubling were the defensive positions she could identify around the compound perimeter. What intelligence reports had described as agricultural terraces were actually carefully constructed fighting positions, designed to provide cover for defenders while creating interlocking fields of fire that would trap attackers in a deadly crossfire. The compound wasn't a meeting place for Taliban commanders. It was a carefully prepared killing ground. Santos immediately attempted to contact Morrison's team using her encrypted radio, but the mountain terrain that made her position so advantageous for shooting also interfered with radio communications. The rocky peaks and deep valleys created dead zones where radio signals couldn't penetrate, and her attempts to establish contact resulted in nothing but static. She faced a dilemma that went to the heart of military protocol and personal responsibility. Her official mission was to provide overwatch support, which meant staying hidden and intervening only if the scout team came under direct attack. But her combat experience told her that Morrison's team was walking into a trap that would likely kill all 6 men before she could provide effective support. Military doctrine emphasized following orders and maintaining operational security. Breaking radio silence or abandoning her assigned position could compromise the entire mission and potentially endanger other American forces operating in the region. But Santos also understood that doctrine was written by officers who had never looked through a scope at good soldiers walking unknowingly toward their deaths. She made a decision that would later become the subject of military ethics discussions and leadership training courses. Using her knowledge of the team's planned route, she began moving to an intermediate position that would allow her to provide more effective support when the trap was sprung. It meant abandoning her assigned Overwatch position and operating outside of official mission parameters, but it also meant being in position to save lives when everything went wrong. Morrison's team continued their approach toward the target compound, unaware that they were being tracked by multiple Taliban observation posts that had been established specifically to monitor American infiltration routes. The enemy had spent weeks studying American patrol patterns, learning to anticipate how special operations teams would approach the valley based on terrain analysis and tactical doctrine. Taliban commander Mahmoud al-Rashid had planned this operation with the patience and attention to detail that had made him one of the most wanted men in Afghanistan. A former Afghan army officer who had been trained by American advisors before switching sides, he understood both American tactics and the cultural pressures that made American commanders predictable in their decision-making. Al-Rashid's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to ambush American patrols in random encounters, he would create an irresistible target that would draw elite American forces into a predetermined killing zone. The intelligence about high-value target meetings had been deliberately leaked through sources that American intelligence trusted, ensuring that the false information would be believable and actionable. The compound had been prepared over several months, with hidden fighting positions carved into the rocky terrain and carefully camouflaged weapon emplacements that would remain invisible until the moment of attack. Al-Rashid had positioned nearly 40 fighters around the valley, all of them experienced veterans who understood the importance of patience and fire discipline. Most importantly, Al-Rashid had planned for American air support and extraction procedures. His men carried portable surface-to-air missiles that would make helicopter rescue extremely dangerous, and he had positioned additional forces to block the most likely escape routes that surviving Americans might use to reach safety. It was a comprehensive trap designed to capture or kill an entire American special operations team. Morrison's team reached their planned observation point at approximately 1,100 hours, establishing a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the target compound. Through their binoculars and camera equipment, they could see clear evidence of recent activity: fresh tire tracks, recently repaired buildings, and what appeared to be several vehicles parked behind the main structure. Carlos Martinez began photographing the compound systematically, documenting everything that might be useful for intelligence analysis or mission planning. The photos will be transmitted back to base via encrypted satellite communication, providing commanders with the visual confirmation they needed to authorize further action. Ghost Williams established communication with base and began transmitting their initial observations. Eagle Base, this is Scout 6. We have eyes on target. Confirm recent activity. Multiple structures show signs of current occupation. Recommend immediate analysis of photo intelligence before proceeding to next phase. The response from base was immediate and encouraging. Scout 6, this is Eagle Base. Excellent work. Continue observation and documentation. Prepare for possible extended surveillance mission based on target activity levels. What none of them realized was that their radio transmissions were being monitored by Taliban forces equipped with sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. Al-Rashid's men had been tracking the American team's approach for the past hour, allowing them to move into final attack positions while the Americans focused on their observation mission. Tommy Chun was the first to notice something wrong. His instincts, honed by months of combat experience, detected subtle changes in the environment that suggested nearby human presence. Birds that had been singing moments earlier had fallen silent. Small animals that typically moved through the underbrush during daylight hours had disappeared. The natural sounds of the mountain environment had been replaced by an unnatural quiet that experienced soldiers learned to recognize as a warning of imminent danger. "Something's not right," Chun whispered to Morrison, pointing toward the terrain below their position. "The whole area's gone quiet. That usually means we're not alone up here." Morrison immediately ordered his team to increase security posture, with each man covering a different sector while maintaining their observation mission. They were trained to handle situations where they might be detected by enemy forces, but their current position left them vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Tank Rodriguez spotted the first clear evidence of enemy presence when sunlight reflected off metal in the rocks approximately 300 meters from their position. It could have been natural mineral deposits in the stone, but Rodriguez's demolitions training had taught him to notice details that might indicate hidden explosive devices or weapon emplacements. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Rodriguez reported quietly. "Possible weapon position or observation post. Can't get a clear identification, but something's definitely there." The Martinez brothers immediately began packing their equipment while maintaining visual observation of the compound. If they needed to evacuate quickly, they couldn't afford to leave sensitive intelligence-gathering equipment behind for enemy forces to capture and analyze. Ghost Williams attempted to contact base for guidance, but his radio calls were met with static and interference that suggested either equipment malfunction or deliberate enemy jamming. Loss of communication with base was one of the worst-case scenarios for special operations teams, as it meant that extraction support might not be available when needed. Morrison faced the classic dilemma of military leadership: incomplete information, multiple potential threats, and the need to make immediate decisions that would determine whether his men lived or died. They could attempt to withdraw immediately, but movement during daylight hours would make them visible to any enemy forces in the area. They could remain in their current position and hope that they hadn't been detected, but that assumed that the enemy wasn't already maneuvering to attack them. The decision was made for them when the first sniper bullet struck the rock inches from Chen's head, sending stone fragments spraying across their position. The shot had come from a concealed position nearly 400 meters away, indicating that enemy forces were not only present, but had been planning this engagement for some time. "Contact! Contact!" Morrison shouted into his radio as his team immediately took defensive positions among the rocky terrain. Scout 6 taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate extraction and close air support. But there was no response from base. The radios that had been working perfectly minutes earlier were now producing nothing but electronic noise. They were alone in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, with no way to call for help and no clear route to safety. The trap had been sprung, and 6 American soldiers were about to fight for their lives against overwhelming odds. What they didn't know was that Santos had anticipated this moment. She had moved to a position where she could see the enemy forces that Morrison's team couldn't detect, and she was already calculating range and wind conditions for the shots that would determine whether her fellow soldiers lived or died. The female sharpshooter they didn't know was there was about to become their salvation, one perfectly aimed bullet at a time. Santos had been watching the Taliban fighters move into position for nearly 20 minutes before the first shot was fired at Morrison's team. From her elevated position, she could see the entire battlefield spread out below her like a three-dimensional tactical map. The enemy had positioned themselves with professional precision, creating interlocking fields of fire that would make escape virtually impossible for anyone trapped in the valley below. Through her scope, she counted at least 35 enemy fighters distributed across multiple positions. They were armed with a mixture of AK-47 assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and several crew-served weapons that could deliver devastating firepower against individual targets. Most troubling were the 2 sniper teams she had identified, positioned to cover the most likely escape routes that American forces might use to reach safety. The Taliban had clearly planned this operation with military expertise that went far beyond typical insurgent capabilities. Their positions were mutually supporting, their communications appeared coordinated, and their patience suggested leadership that understood the value of allowing the trap to develop fully before springing it. This wasn't a random encounter with local fighters. It was a sophisticated ambush designed to capture or kill American Special Operations personnel. When the first sniper bullet barely missed Chen's head, Santos immediately shifted into combat mode. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. Friendly forces under attack, multiple enemy targets, and the need for precise, rapid engagement that would neutralize threats without endangering the soldiers she was trying to protect. Her first target was the enemy sniper who had fired at Morrison's team. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flash location and calculate the approximate position of the hidden shooter. The range was 847 meters, well within her capability, but requiring careful adjustment for wind conditions and elevation differences. Santos took a deep breath, allowed her heartbeat to steady, and gently squeezed the trigger. Her bullet traveled across the valley in less than 2 seconds, striking the Taliban sniper center mass and eliminating the immediate threat to Morrison's team. The enemy fighter dropped immediately, his rifle clattering against the rocks as he fell. But there was no time to confirm the kill or adjust her position. Enemy fighters throughout the valley had opened fire on Morrison's team, creating a storm of bullets that forced the American soldiers to take cover behind whatever protection they could find. Santos immediately began acquiring additional targets, prioritizing the enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to the trapped scouts. Morrison's team was pinned down among a cluster of large boulders that provided minimal protection from the crossfire that was now converging on their position. Ghost Williams continued attempting to establish radio contact with base, but the electronic jamming was completely effective. They were cut off from outside support and rapidly running low on ammunition as they returned fire at muzzle flashes and movement they could barely identify. "We've got to move," Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "Staying here means we all die." Tank Rodriguez had identified what appeared to be a slightly better defensive position approximately 50 meters away, but reaching it would require crossing open ground while under fire from multiple directions. It was the kind of tactical decision that could save lives or get everyone killed, with no way to know which outcome was more likely. Tommy Chin pointed toward a narrow ravine that might provide concealment during movement. "That gully runs northeast for maybe 200 meters. If we can reach it, we might be able to break contact and find an extraction point." But before Morrison could give the order to move, another enemy sniper bullet struck the rock where Luis Martinez was taking cover, sending stone splinters into his face and temporarily blinding him with blood and debris. The enemy had them precisely located and was systematically eliminating their defensive options. Santos had been tracking the second sniper team and was ready when they revealed their position by firing. Her return shot traveled 923 meters across the valley, striking the enemy shooter in the upper chest and dropping him instantly. But even as she worked the bolt action to chamber another round, she could see additional enemy fighters moving to flank Morrison's position from both sides. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Taliban fighters were executing a textbook pincer movement, using the terrain to approach the trapped Americans from multiple directions while maintaining suppressive fire that prevented effective resistance. Within minutes, Morrison's team would be completely surrounded and facing point-blank gunfire from all sides. Santos made a decision that went far beyond her assigned mission parameters. Instead of remaining in her overwatch position and providing selective fire support, she began a systematic engagement of every enemy fighter she could identify. It meant exposing her own position to return fire, but it also meant disrupting the Taliban attack before it could completely overwhelm the scout team. Her third shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was maneuvering with an RPG launcher that would have been devastating if used against Morrison's position. The fourth and fifth shots targeted a crew-served weapon team that was setting up to provide enfilading fire. Each shot was carefully aimed and precisely delivered, turning Santos from a hidden observer into an active participant in the firefight. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Taliban fighters who had been advancing confidently toward their trapped prey suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from an unknown location. Several of their key weapon systems had been eliminated by invisible shots, and their carefully coordinated attack was beginning to collapse as individual fighters sought cover instead of maintaining their assault positions. Commander al-Rashid realized that his carefully planned ambush was being disrupted by an unidentified sniper operating somewhere in the high ground overlooking the valley. He immediately ordered several of his fighters to locate and eliminate the threat, but Santos's position was expertly concealed and protected by natural terrain features that made approach extremely difficult. Morrison's team recognized that something had changed in the tactical situation. Enemy fire that had been overwhelming and precisely directed was becoming sporadic and defensive. Several of the weapon positions that had been pinning them down had fallen silent, and the coordinated advance that had been closing in on their position seemed to have stalled. "Someone's out there helping us," Ghost Williams observed during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Professional sniper work, very high-end stuff. Military precision." Chen had been observing the enemy positions and could see the results of Santos's shooting. Whoever it is, they're picking off their key personnel. Look at Sector 7, where that machine gun was set up. No movement, no muzzle flashes. Same thing with the RPG team that was moving up the left flank. Morrison didn't know who was providing the sniper support, but he understood that they had been given a tactical opportunity that might not last long. "We move now while they're disorganized. Chun, take point toward that ravine. Martinez brothers, you're right behind him. Tank and Ghost, we provide covering fire and follow." The movement was executed with the precision that comes from months of combat experience and absolute trust between team members. Chun led them in a low, fast movement toward the ravine, while Tank and Ghost provided suppressive fire to keep enemy heads down. The Martinez brothers carried their wounded brother Luis between them, refusing to leave anyone behind despite the additional risk it created. Santos provided overwatch for their movement, systematically engaging any enemy fighter who attempted to target the moving Americans. Her shots came at precisely timed intervals, each one eliminating a specific threat before it could develop into something deadly. Her ammunition was limited, and every shot had to count if she was going to keep Morrison's team alive long enough for them to reach safety. The Taliban fighters were becoming increasingly frustrated and desperate as their ambush continued to deteriorate. What should have been a quick elimination of trapped American soldiers had turned into a prolonged firefight where they were taking casualties from an enemy they couldn't locate or engage effectively. Several fighters began firing randomly toward the high ground where they suspected the sniper might be positioned. Al-Rashid ordered his remaining forces to focus on preventing the American team from escaping rather than trying to locate the sniper. If they could keep Morrison's team trapped in the valley until reinforcements arrived, they might still be able to salvage something from the failed ambush. He directed his fighters to establish blocking positions along the most likely escape routes. But Santos could see the enemy redeployment and was already adapting her tactics accordingly. She began targeting the fighters who were moving to block escape routes, using her elevated position and superior optics to engage enemies that Morrison's team couldn't even detect. Each shot was a calculated decision about which threat posed the greatest danger to the soldiers she was protecting. Morrison's team reached the ravine and began moving northeast toward what they hoped would be an extraction point. The narrow gully provided concealment from direct observation, but it also channeled their movement in a predictable direction that enemy forces could anticipate. They were making progress towards safety, but they were far from being out of danger. Ghost Williams continued attempting to establish radio communication as they moved, finally getting a weak signal that allowed him to transmit their approximate position and urgent need for extraction support. The response was immediate. 2 Apache attack helicopters were being diverted to their area, but it would be at least 20 minutes before they could arrive. 20 minutes was an eternity in a combat situation where every second mattered. The team would have to continue evading enemy forces while covering several miles of rough terrain before they could reach a location suitable for helicopter extraction. And the Taliban fighters were undoubtedly calling for additional reinforcements to help trap the fleeing Americans. Santos realized that her mission was evolving from providing overwatch to conducting a fighting withdrawal that would protect Morrison's team during their escape. She began moving from position to position, using her knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the Taliban fighters who were trying to locate her while continuing to provide sniper support for the Americans in the ravine below. Her ammunition situation was becoming critical. She had started the mission with 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, and she had already expended more than half of her supply. Every remaining shot would have to be perfectly placed to maximize its tactical impact. There was no room for wasted ammunition or marginal hits that merely wounded enemies instead of eliminating them. The next phase of the escape required Morrison's team to cross a small valley where they would be exposed to observation and fire from multiple directions. Santos positioned herself to overwatch the crossing, identifying 3 enemy positions that could threaten the Americans during their most vulnerable moment. She engaged the first position just as Morrison's team began their movement, eliminating 2 Taliban fighters who had been waiting in ambush. Her second and third shots targeted a crew-serve weapon team that was attempting to set up in a flanking position. The precision of her shooting and the timing of her engagements allowed Morrison's team to cross the exposed area without taking casualties. But the Taliban forces were learning to adapt to her tactics. They began using coordinated movement and suppressive fire to mask their positions, making it more difficult for Santos to identify and engage specific targets. Several enemy fighters had managed to get close enough to her general area that she could hear them calling to each other as they searched for her position. Santos made the decision to abandon her current hide and move to a completely different area where she could continue providing support while avoiding the enemy's search teams. The movement required her to cross approximately 300 meters of broken terrain while carrying all of her equipment and remaining ammunition. As she moved, she could hear Morrison's team continuing their escape through the ravine system. They were making good progress, but Taliban reinforcements were beginning to arrive in the area. Fresh fighters who hadn't been involved in the original ambush were positioning themselves along likely escape routes, creating new threats that would have to be addressed. The sound of approaching helicopters finally reached the valley as the 2 Apache gunships arrived in the area. But the Taliban forces were prepared for air support, and they immediately engaged the helicopters with small arms fire and portable surface-to-air missiles. One of the Apaches took damage and was forced to withdraw, leaving only a single helicopter to provide support. Santos used the distraction created by the helicopter engagement to move into a final overwatch position. From this location, she could see Morrison's team approaching what appeared to be a suitable landing zone for extraction. But she could also see Taliban forces moving to intercept them before the helicopter could land. Her final engagements were the most critical of the entire mission. With only 8 rounds of ammunition remaining, she had to eliminate specific threats that would prevent the extraction from succeeding. Each shot was carefully planned and precisely executed, targeting enemy fighters who posed the greatest risk to the helicopter and the soldiers it was trying to rescue. Morrison's team reached the landing zone just as the Apache helicopter began its approach. The pilot was flying through active enemy fire, using the aircraft's armor and defensive systems to survive long enough to extract the trapped soldiers. It was the kind of heroic flying that happens when pilots understand that good soldiers will die if they don't succeed. Santos provided covering fire during the extraction, using her last 4 rounds to eliminate Taliban fighters who were attempting to engage the helicopter with RPGs during its most vulnerable moment. Her shooting was flawless under extreme pressure, each bullet finding its target despite the chaos and confusion of the ongoing firefight. The helicopter lifted off with Morrison's team aboard, climbing rapidly to escape the effective range of enemy small arms fire. They were finally safe, but Santos was still alone in enemy territory with no ammunition and Taliban search teams closing in on her position. She began her own escape and evasion using skills learned during survival training and months of mountain operations to avoid capture while moving toward a potential extraction point. It would take her 18 hours of careful movement through hostile territory, but she eventually reached a location where she could be safely extracted by American forces. When Morrison's team was debriefed after their rescue, they learned for the first time about the female sniper who had saved their lives. Santos's precise shooting and tactical decision-making had disrupted a carefully planned ambush and enabled their escape from what should have been a fatal trap. Her actions demonstrated the kind of courage and skill that define the finest traditions of military service. The mission report noted that Sergeant Maria Santos had engaged and eliminated 17 enemy fighters during the course of the operation, each shot carefully documented and verified according to military protocols. But more importantly, her actions had prevented the loss of 6 American soldiers and disrupted a major Taliban operation that could have claimed many more lives. Santos received the Silver Star for her actions that day, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. But for her, the real reward was knowing that Morrison, Williams, Rodriguez, Chun, and both Martinez brothers had returned safely to their families. In a war where victory was often measured in lives saved rather than territory conquered, she had achieved something truly meaningful. The Taliban never again attempted to use the valley where the ambush had failed. Local fighters began calling the area Death Valley of the Female Ghost, and they learned to fear the places where American snipers might be watching. Al-Rashid himself was killed 3 months later by another precision shot from an unknown sniper, leading to speculation that the female American shooter had returned to finish what she had started. Morrison's scout team continued their combat missions for the remainder of their deployment, but they never forgot the lesson they had learned in those Afghan mountains. Sometimes the difference between life and death came from unexpected places, from heroes who worked in silence and shadows, protecting their fellow soldiers with skill and dedication that went far beyond the call of duty. When they returned home to their families and civilian lives, They carried with them the knowledge that they owed their lives to a woman they had never met, whose steady hands and perfect aim had turned the tide in their darkest hour. It was a debt that could never be repaid, but it would never be forgotten by 6 men who understood the true meaning of brotherhood in arms.